Hey juniors, it is Friday afternoon. I already had the U.S. history class, but I wanted to make a quick video for you. There were several kids that were gone, so whether you're in quarantine or you're just homesick today or you've got something else going on, there were enough of you gone today that I figured it would justify going ahead and doing a short video lecture. So I didn't have juniors on Wednesday because they were taking the SAT. So this is actually the only day of the week that I've had you in class since we didn't have school on Monday. And so I'm gonna kind of zip through the lessons super quick. Somebody's trying to call me. So we talked a little bit about Washington, D.C. and the events and the places that you guys went to, things that were your favorite, that sort of thing. And then I segued into our new unit on George Washington's presidency. I'm pretty tired. It's been a doozy of a week. So short week, but furious. So, but we started talking about the Washington presidency. And before you guys went to Washington, D.C., I showed you a clip from the John Adams movie where George Washington was sworn in as president in New York City. And John Adams was with him. He was the vice president. He was elected vice president. New York City served as the temporary capital of the new United States for just a very brief period of time. It was then moved to Philadelphia, and George Washington served as president all 8 years while he was in Philadelphia. He chose the location for Washington, D.C., and he oversaw the architecture and construction and the location and everything, but it obviously wasn't completed while he was president. In fact, John Adams was the first president to move into the White House. It was incomplete. And I think the only thing that was built was one building that housed the House and Senate and a few houses. And that was 3 years after Washington left office, and actually it was a year after he died. So he died 2 years after he left office. So what we talked about today were some of the important aspects of his presidency. Now that you've been to Mount Vernon, you have probably a greater appreciation for how difficult it must have been for him to leave his home and overseeing that huge, massive plantation and leaving it to serve his country in the capacity as commander of the Continental Army or as president of the United States, which he did. So I'm going to talk about the highlights. The first thing that I would like to say is that this next unit that we're covering is going to cover the Founding Father presidents. And you'll see a slide in your PowerPoint that I'm going to connect to this lesson that shows George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Those are the Founding Father presidents. All of them were part of that founding era. Some of them contributed more than others. George Washington, obviously, his handprint is over everything. John Adams led the independence movement. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is the father of the Constitution, and James Monroe was a young pup during the American Revolution and served in Washington's army and was actually shot and wounded at the Battle of Trenton. So they were all around during that era and participated and played a pretty significant role. So we're going to focus on those 5 presidents and the good and the bad, the ugly, the things that worked, the things that didn't work, the precedents that was set by various presidents. And then we're going to kind of fast track to Abraham Lincoln. In between James Monroe and Abraham Lincoln are a few presidents that didn't do a whole lot. There's some stood out more than others, but the biggest debate during that period of time from James Monroe to Abraham Lincoln was the issue related to the expansion of the United States and whether or not slavery would continue to grow and be a part of the growing country, or if it would cease and desist, as they say, or if the South would tolerate an end to slavery and continue to stay in the Union. So of course we know that hindsight that it led to a civil war. So anyway, so let's introduce George Washington. I'm going to zip through my slides here. He served for two terms, not 2 years, 2 terms. He set that precedent. He could have probably continued to serve if he had wanted to. But he felt like it was important for the country to see a peaceful exchange of power from one person to the other. In Europe, generally speaking, monarchs, served the entire time they lived, and so It was a birthright, baton passing to the next son or daughter. Sometimes European countries devolved into war when the next leader was unknown or unsure of himself or herself. And so George Washington felt it was important for the American people to understand that power can be transferred peaceably through election from one person to another. First things first, George Washington was the head of the newly formed executive branch. John Adams was the only person working for him as vice president, and so he had to form a cabinet, a group of advisors that would advise him on this new experiment, this American experiment. Some historians say that George Washington had a rock star cabinet. He was surrounded by very educated, very smart, very world-wise people. And so this next slide lists them. Thomas Jefferson was recalled from Europe, where he was serving as a diplomat, to serve as the first Secretary of State. A Secretary of State serves the nation as the face of our country to other countries. State is a word that they used back then to refer to countries. So he was the Secretary of our country on behalf of all of the countries that sent diplomats to the United States. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, he was a money man. He understood finances very well. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had a different view of the future of America. Thomas Jefferson pictured an agrarian society, which is farming and that sort of thing, which is the circumstances that he lived in. And Alexander Hamilton envisioned a manufacturing mecca in the United States, where industry and manufacturing and banking excelled and would be the powerhouse of our country. And so they had a very different view of what America would become. And it shows because these two men could not figure out how to get along. And we'll talk a little more about this in a minute. Henry Knox was appointed Secretary of War. That's what they called it back then. They've changed the name to Secretary of Defense. He was a longtime friend of George Washington, served him well during the American Revolution. He's the guy that went and picked up the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to help George Washington liberate Boston. He served with him at the Battle of Trenton and various other battles, and was a very dear friend to him. And so within this cabinet, you have a lot of competing voices, and George Washington loved to hear a variety of opinions on things. And I would say Alexander Hamilton had his ear the most. He was like a son to him. He served him all through the American Revolution. He was about the age that a Washington son would be. Thomas Jefferson was more in George Washington's class, so to speak, plantation owner, Virginian, but they didn't have the same relationship. Jefferson had been overseas while Hamilton was working with Washington during the war. So Hamilton had decided that in order for the United States to expand their industrial power, they needed to grow and build and expand and borrow money in order to do that. He understood that our country had the ability to excel in ways that, with raw materials and space and other things that a lot of countries in Europe didn't have, but that we would need money to do that. And so he wanted to borrow money from European countries like Amsterdam or the Netherlands, the French, to build a massive infrastructure and whatnot. And he knew that they wouldn't loan us the money if they didn't think we were good for it. And so, since we were a new country with no credit history, he came up with a plan to have the federal government take on all of the debts from the individual states that they had incurred during the American Revolution, and then pay those debts off. So individual states had borrowed money from foreign countries, from individuals, and needed to pay them back. And so if the federal government would take those debts and pay those debts back on behalf of the individual states, we would build credit. And then other countries would be willing to loan us money because they knew we were good for it. Well, Thomas Jefferson thought that was a terrible idea. And not only that, Alexander Hamilton wanted to create a Bank of the United States that would facilitate all of this transaction of money, tax dollars and whatnot. And that also was very alarming to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, there's no constitutional authority for a Bank of the United States. There's nothing in the Constitution under Article 2, the executive branch, or Article 1, the legislative branch, that gives the government, the federal government, the authority to create a Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton argued that it was proper and necessary based upon that clause in the preamble that suggests that the government has the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to fulfill the powers given to them in the Constitution. So they argued about it back and forth. It got pretty heated at one point. Jefferson was very concerned that the moneyed power would be in the North, not in the South. And so they came up with a compromise. James Madison invited Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to his home in Virginia, where they sat down and had dinner. I think it was in Virginia at the time. It might have been in Philadelphia. I can't remember. But James Madison sent the invites. And so Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson came and had dinner together, and they compromised. In exchange for Jefferson supporting a Bank of the United States and the federal government taking on the debts of the states, Alexander Hamilton, in exchange, agreed to support a United States capital in the South. I think Jefferson thought that would balance out the power issue. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, there's a song that Aaron Burr sings called "The Room Where It Happened," and that is what that song is about. It's about that dinner in which those two men, Hamilton and Jefferson, came up with a compromise that satisfied both of them at the time, but nobody really knows what went down. All we know is that there was an invite, there was a dinner, and when the dinner was over, both Hamilton and Jefferson had decided to support one another's ideas. And so we suspect that what happened in the room was that this deal was struck. Let's see here. Okay, let me move on. So the next slide says, important domestic events of Washington's presidency. And so domestic means the homeland, what happened here at home, versus foreign policy, policy that the United States has about foreign governments. And so I have several things listed here that were important to the Washington presidency. One of them, the first one I just walked you through, was the National Bank and the U.S. Capitol issue. The second one is the rise of political parties and a two-party system. And so George Washington was opposed to political parties, but because we are a majority rule country, meaning you have to have 51% of the people on board for any given thing, whether it's electing a president or passing a law, a two-party system was inevitable. There's the 50% that believe this and the 50% that believe that, or some derivative of that. And so while Washington really warned the political class about the two-party system, it evolved anyway. So he is technically considered a unclassified or undesignated president, meaning he was not affiliated with any political party. Many people would argue that he was a Federalist because he did support the federal government more so than state rights. So it depends on what chart you look at. So I have him as undesignated. But ultimately, the political system early on split into the Federalists, which is what George Washington and John Adams would technically fall under, and the Democratic Republicans, which is what Jefferson and Madison and those folks camp that they fell into. Eventually, the word Republicans is going to drop off of that, and it's going to be the Federalists, Democratic Republicans, and then it's going to be the Whigs and the Democrats, and then it's going to be the Republicans and the Democrats. And we've been sitting in that Democrat-Republican lane since the Civil War, actually. The next thing is the Whiskey Rebellion. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail because you'll probably read about it in your reading assignment, but in order to raise revenue during this era, the way that the federal government raised money, because there was no state income tax, there was no federal income tax, was through tariffs. The government would put tariffs on products being imported or exported from said country, and for every imported item, that country or that company had to pay a tax. And that's how the government paid for things. It wasn't enough to pay for everything. And so sometimes they instituted what were called excise taxes, a tax on a specific thing. So the example that I used in class is, let's say the government wants to raise money for, let's say, a COVID vaccine. I think that most people can get the vaccine for free if they wanted to get the vaccine, because the government pays for it. And it's expensive. So let's say the government wanted to place an excise tax on something in order to pay for that program. And so they decided to tax every bottle of water purchased in the United States a penny. And so every time somebody buys a bottle of water or a flat of water, they are charged a penny per bottle, and those pennies go into a bank account that then goes to pay for the vaccines. So in this situation, Hamilton was trying to raise money for some said project, and he decided to ask Congress to pass a law that would place an excise tax on whiskey. Whiskey was cheap at the time, everybody drank it, and it would actually raise a lot of revenue. And so the community that was affected by this were farmers in western Pennsylvania that were primarily responsible for most of the whiskey made in the United States. And so when word came down the pipe that Congress had passed a law placing an excise tax on whiskey, the farmers said they weren't going to pay it. They're like, come and make us. We're not going to pay your tax. You can't make us pay your tax. Blah, blah, blah. And George Washington understood intuitively, if I let this go and don't force them to pay this tax, I'm going to be setting a precedent that it doesn't matter if Congress passes a law. If I don't enforce it, if I don't help enforce the law, Congress's job won't matter, and it will be a lawless country. It's a little bit reminiscent of Shays' Rebellion. And so the farmers were stubborn, and so George Washington decided to raise an army of several thousand people, and he himself led the the procession down to Pennsylvania. He rode Nelson or one of his other white horses, and sent word ahead to the farmers in Pennsylvania that there was a massive army on their way to collect the taxes, do or die. And it didn't take very long for the farmers to change their tune. And so George Washington didn't even end up riding all the way down to Pennsylvania. And the farmers decided that they would concede and pay the taxes. And so that is the first real big example of a situation where the executive branch, which was created to enforce laws of Congress, where the president actually used an army to enforce a law passed by Congress, and that set a precedent in motion that still is in effect to this day. And then I just briefly mentioned that we're going to talk about a significant Indian battle that took place, a battle between the Indian tribes in the Ohio River Valley when George Washington was president. I actually read about it, and I was astonished at the carnage, the savagery, truly the savagery of some of the attacks by the Indian tribes, and then conversely, the retribution and the hard hammer of the U.S. or the military that George Washington sent after them. So we'll talk about that next week. And then lastly, the last thing we talked about, which I've already mentioned, is that George Washington set a 2-term precedent. He decided he was going to step down after 2 terms and let the country witness a peaceful exchange of power from one person to the other. And so after we finished that brief lesson, we completed our travel journals for Washington, D.C., which is for a project grade. I had them do it in class. They turned them into me, and then I'm going to give them back to them after I grade them. So I have yours. I have copies of the notes that I've already made for you. And I've got the brochures and a couple of other things pinned together and put up in the envelope on the wall that says "While you were gone." So for as long as you're gone during this, whether it's you're in quarantine or whatever the reason you're gone, I'm going to go ahead and make those copies for you, so they'll be here for you when you return. Now, I do have a reading assignment. I've asked the class to read Chapter 6, let me see here, pages 113 through 121. So about 8 pages, which cover much of what we talked about today and what we're going to talk about on Monday. So I will ask you, I will have a couple of writing prompts for you on Monday. So just to clarify, next week is another weird schedule. We have parent-teacher conferences on Thursday and Friday. And so they're essentially taking Friday classes and moving them to Monday. There's no chapel on Monday. Monday is not a fast Monday with chapel and all of your classes. It's going to be a Wednesday, Friday schedule. So you have all of your Wednesday classes on Monday, plus electives after lunch, and then Tuesday, Thursday will be normal, except that there will be no electives on Thursday. Parent-teacher conferences start after lunch. I think the dismissal is 11:45 or something like that. So your classes will be an hour and 15 minutes instead of an hour 30. But you'll have Tuesday, Thursday block classes. You'll have Monday, Wednesday classes, block classes. And so I will see you on Monday for a full 90 minutes. So I'm probably going to later today or this evening take pictures of all of the pages, because I realize that some of you may not have access to your textbooks. And while I hate giving homework on the weekend, because we've been gone a week and then all this quarantine stuff is going on, we've got to push ahead. And we have a short week next week. So I'm going to snap some pictures of the pages, upload them in an email probably, and send them to everybody in case they forgot their books. I think Monday's going to be a little crazy. I think everybody's going to be a little confused. So anyway, that's all. I'm going to load this to Google Classroom. Hopefully it'll load pretty quickly and you'll be caught up. So see ya. I'm thinking about you all. Bye.